The silver bolt tore through the dungeon air, aimed directly at her heart. Kaine Thornwood didn't think. He didn't weigh the political consequences or the logic of protecting a supposed traitor. He threw his massive body between the bars and the incoming death, 3 hours earlier. The clinking of crystal and the low hum of predator politics filled Shadowpine Manor's grand ballroom. At a cramped table by the kitchen doors, Lyra Blackwood kept her head down, praying the solstice banquet would end before the highborn wolves noticed her frayed hem. She was an afterthought, a disgraced outcast meant to blend into the shadows. The annual solstice banquet of the North American Lichen Council was less of a celebration and more of a ruthless, velvet-draped battlefield. Held at the historic Shadowpine Manor, a sprawling Gothic mansion nestled deep in the damp, pine-heavy forests of Washington state, it was the one night a year where bloodlines were paraded, alliances were forged in shadowed alcoves, and weaknesses were mercilessly exploited. Lyra Blackwood sat at table 47. It was the furthest table from the elevated royal dais, positioned so close to the swinging kitchen doors that she could smell the sharp tang of copper from the raw steaks being prepared for the Alpha Guard. She adjusted the sleeves of her emerald green silk dress. It was a beautiful gown, technically a vintage piece she had spent 3 weeks restoring by hand. But next to the custom couture worn by the daughters of regional alphas, it screamed of her poverty. She wasn't supposed to be here. Or rather, she didn't want to be here. 10 years ago, the Blackwood name carried weight. Her father, Marcus Blackwood, had been the lead tactician for the former Alpha King, a brilliant strategist who could predict enemy movements 3 steps ahead, who had secured the borders of the Pacific Northwest territories with an efficiency that bordered on legendary. But when a rogue faction breached the northern perimeters, resulting in the death of the old king, the blame was swiftly and brutally pinned on Marcus. It was a framed job orchestrated by the powerful Ashford family. But the evidence had been too neatly planted. Marcus was executed. Her mother, Vivian, died of a broken heart shortly after. And Lyra, then only 12 years old, was stripped of her rank and banished to the outer edge of the territory to work as a lowly botanical apprentice. She was only at the banquet tonight because of a royal decree from the new reigning monarch, Alpha King Kaine Thornwood. Kaine had mandated that every unwed female of age within his territory attend the solstice gala. The council was pressuring him to take a mate and produce an heir to stabilize his volatile reign. And the banquet was essentially a glorified high-stakes cattle call. Lyra earned $847 a month cultivating medicinal herbs in a crumbling greenhouse at the edge of the Cascade Wilderness Reserve. She had no illusions about her place in this glittering hierarchy. She would sit quietly, endure the mandatory appearance, and disappear back into the forest before midnight. I didn't think security let strays past the outer gates. Lyra stiffened. The cloying scent of heavily sprayed jasmine and expensive champagne washed over her before the speaker even materialized. Morgana Ashford. Morgana was the daughter of the Eastern Ridge Alpha, the very man who had signed Lyra's father's execution order. She was tall, statuesque, and dripping in diamonds, wearing a blood-red gown that looked like it cost more than the greenhouse Lyra lived in. Morgana was also the woman everyone in the room expected Kaine Thornwood to announce as his chosen mate by midnight. "Good evening, Morgana," Lyra said, keeping her voice carefully neutral. She didn't look up from her half-empty water glass. "Rule number 1 of surviving as an outcast, do not engage the apex predators." "Is it?" Morgana purred, leaning against the back of the empty chair next to Lyra. She swirled the amber liquid in her crystal flute. "It feels rather insulting to the rest of us. We spend months preparing for the Alpha King's consideration, and they force us to share breathing room with a traitor's spawn. Tell me, Lyra, did you sew that dress yourself, or did you steal it from a dead human's estate sale?" A few of Morgana's sycophants lurking just behind her snickered softly. Lyra finally lifted her chin. She had her father's striking silver-gray eyes. Eyes that unnerved people because they looked entirely too observant for a servant. "It's a mandate, Morgana. If you have an issue with the guest list, take it up with the king. Though I imagine you'll have plenty of time to whisper your complaints into his ear later." Morgana's smile tightened into a sneer, her canines flashing just enough to be a threat. "You have a sharp tongue for an Omega. Enjoy your night by the kitchen, Blackwood. Take a good look at the dais. That is the closest you will ever get to power again." With a flick of her wrist, Morgana deliberately tipped her glass. A splash of cold champagne hit the sleeve of Lyra's emerald dress, leaving a dark spreading stain. "Oh, clumsy me," Morgana mocked, turning on her heel. "Try not to drip on the marble." Lyra clamped her jaw shut, her hands trembling in her lap. She grabbed a cloth napkin and dabbed fiercely at the silk, biting the inside of her cheek so hard she tasted copper. Just a few more hours, she told herself. focusing on the rhythmic, calming beat of her own heart. Midnight comes, he chooses Morgana. The mandate is lifted, and I go back to my herbs. Suddenly, the ambient chatter of 400 werewolves died in a wave. It wasn't a gradual fade. It was instantaneous, as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. The heavy oak doors at the top of the grand staircase had opened. The Alpha King had arrived. Kaine Thornwood did not walk into a room. He claimed it, standing 6 feet 4 inches with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the entire Lycan Council. Kaine radiated an aura of dominance that made the inner wolves of everyone present whimper in submission. His dark hair was immaculately styled, but there was a feral edge to his sharp jawline and piercing amber eyes that no bespoke tuxedo could ever tame. Beside him walked his mother, the Queen Dowager Seraphina. Seraphina was a legend in her own right. Frail in body but iron in spirit, she leaned heavily on a silver-tipped cane. Her right eye was clouded over milky white, the mark of a moonseer. It was said she didn't just see the world. She saw the threads of fate that held it together. The string quartet in the corner frantically shifted from pleasant background music to the traditional royal processional anthem. Kaine and Seraphina began their descent down the stairs, flanked by 4 massive elite guards, including Kaine's second-in-command, Callum Redstone. Lyra kept her head bowed respectfully, just like everyone else at her table. But as Kaine reached the bottom of the stairs, a strange sensation washed over her. It started as a spark at the base of her spine, a sudden, inexplicable warmth that radiated outward. Her pulse kicked up, skipping a beat before accelerating into a frantic rhythm. Her acute sense of smell, usually overwhelmed by the conflicting sense of the crowd, suddenly tunneled through the perfumes, the roasted meats, and the floor wax. A new scent pierced her senses. It was intoxicating. Petrichor, the smell of rain on dry earth mixed with cedarwood and dark spicy amber. It was the most comforting and terrifying scent she had ever encountered. Her inner wolf, which had been dormant and subdued for 10 years, suddenly clawed at the edges of her consciousness, howling a single word: mine. Lyra gasped softly, gripping the edge of the table. No, 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 no. This was impossible. The mate bond was a fairy tale, a biological rarity that occurred maybe once in a generation. And even if it were real, the moon goddess would never be cruel enough to tether a disgraced outcast to the Alpha King. As the royal procession moved through the room, making its way toward the dais, Kaine's pacing abruptly slowed. He was 50 feet away, but Lyra saw the exact moment it hit him. His broad shoulders hitched. His amber eyes widened, scanning the room frantically, his nostrils flaring as he dragged in a deep breath. The raw power leaking from him spiked, causing several low-ranking wolves nearby to physically drop to their knees under the oppressive weight of his sudden aggression. Kaine's eyes locked onto the back corner of the room. He locked onto table 47. He locked onto Lyra. The air crackled with invisible electricity. Lyra couldn't look away. For a second, the entire banquet hall fell away, leaving only the crushing intensity of the Alpha King's stare burning into her soul. He began to walk toward her. He ignored the path cleared for him. He ignored Morgana Ashford, who was standing near the front, wearing a practiced, seductive smile that faltered as he strode right past her. Kaine moved with the predatory grace of a stalking wolf, his gaze never leaving Lyra's pale face. Lyra's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She stood up, knocking her chair back with a loud clatter that echoed in the silent room. She wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at her to flee into the forest. But her feet were cemented to the floor. Kaine stopped a mere 3 feet from her. Up close, he was terrifyingly beautiful. His chest heaved against his tailored suit, and a low, possessive rumble vibrated in his throat. "Hugh," he breathed. The word was rough and jagged. Before he could close the final distance, Queen Dowager Seraphina stepped beside him. The old woman's blind eye fluttered, while her good eye fixed sharply on Lyra. Seraphina didn't look at Lyra's stained dress or her worn shoes. She seemed to be looking straight through her skin into her spirit. Seraphina reached out her frail, claw-like hand, gripping Kaine's thick forearm. Her blind eye began to glow with a faint silver light. "Son," Seraphina murmured. In a room full of werewolves, a murmur was as loud as a shout over a loudspeaker. Everyone heard it. "That's your fated Luna." A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. Morgana Ashford dropped her champagne glass. It shattered against the marble floor, a sharp, violent sound that broke the spell. Kaine stiffened. The romantic haze of the mate bond, the primal urge that had dragged him across the room, violently clashed with the cold, hard reality of his rational mind. He recognized her. He recognized the silver-gray eyes of the man his father had executed. "Blackwood," Kaine spat the word, dripping with sudden venomous realization. Lyra flinched as if struck. The intoxicating warmth of the bond shattered, replaced by the freezing reality of who they were. Kaine took a step back, tearing his eyes away from hers, his expression hardening into an impenetrable mask of pure ice. The political implications raced through his mind. A king could not mate a traitor's daughter. It would cause a civil war within the council. The Ashfords would revolt. It had to be a trick, a trap. No, Kaine said, his voice carrying the alpha command echoing off the high ceilings. The seer is mistaken. This is a deception. Seraphina's grip tightened on his arm. Kaine, do not defy the moon. The thread is tied. I am the king, Kaine roared, the sound shaking the crystal chandeliers above. He pointed a trembling, furious finger at Lyra. This woman's bloodline is poison. She is a Blackwood. He turned to his head guard, his chest heaving as he fought his own screaming instincts. Callum, take her to the holding cells in the lower levels. She is to be detained for questioning regarding dark magic and manipulation of the royal family. Callum Redstone stepped forward, looking torn, but he could not disobey a direct alpha order. Wait, please, Lyra cried out as two guards grabbed her arms. The rough handling sent a jolt of protective rage through Kaine, making him bare his teeth and step forward only to forcefully stop himself, his hands balling into fists at his sides. Take her out of my sight, Kaine commanded, turning his back on her, though his whole body shook with the effort. As Lyra was dragged through the swinging kitchen doors, humiliated and terrified, the last thing she saw was Morgana Ashford stepping smoothly up to Kaine's side, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder while shooting Lyra a look of absolute triumphant malice. The descent into Shadowpine Manor's holding cells was a jarring transition from opulence to despair. The air grew instantly colder, trading the scent of roasted duck and expensive perfumes for the harsh metallic tang of damp stone and old blood. Lyra stumbled as the heavy iron door clanged shut behind her, the sound vibrating through her bones. Callum Redstone, the king's second-in-command, released her arms with surprising gentleness once they were out of the public eye. His broad shoulders were tense, his jaw ticking as he looked down at her. I apologize for the rough handling, Lyra, Callum said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, echoing off the subterranean walls. You know how it is. The Alpha's command cannot be challenged in the Great Hall. I know Callum, Lyra whispered, rubbing her bruised wrists. She had known Callum when she was a child, back when her father was still a respected tactician. He had been a young recruit, then eager and kind. But you know I didn't do this. You know I don't possess dark magic. A mate bond cannot be forged by a witch's hex. Callum sighed, running a hand over his closely cropped hair. I know, but King Kaine has the weight of the entire North American Lycan Council on his neck. The Ashford family has been threatening to pull their financial backing, specifically their shell company, Iron Ridge Supply Corporation, which funds half our border security on the Olympic Peninsula. If he mates a Blackwood, the Eastern Ridge Pack will declare civil war. He ushered her into a reinforced cell at the very end of the corridor. It was stark, containing only a metal cot and a small grated drain in the floor. I'll try to talk sense into him once the adrenaline wears off, Callum promised, his eyes filled with a heavy, reluctant sympathy. Just stay quiet. Don't provoke anyone who comes down here. The lock engaged with a heavy final click. Lyra sank onto the cold metal cot, burying her face in her hands. The adrenaline was draining away, leaving behind a profound hollow ache in her chest. The mate bond, now fully awakened and violently rejected by Kaine, felt like a physical wound. It was a phantom tether pulled taut, burning her from the inside out. Blackwood. The voice was a dry, scraping rasp like dead leaves dragging across concrete. Lyra's head snapped up. The sound had come from the adjacent cell, separated by a thick wall of iron bars. She crept closer to the partition, her silver eyes adjusting to the dim, flickering fluorescent light in the hallway. In the shadows of the neighboring cell sat a man. He was shockingly emaciated, his skin pulled taut over sharp cheekbones, his hair long and matted with filth. But as he shifted into the sliver of light, Lyra saw the faint, scarred outline of the Royal Guard tattoo on his exposed collarbone. "Who are you?" Lyra asked, her voice trembling slightly. "My name is Silas." The man coughed, a wet, rattling sound. "Silas Crane. I was the gatekeeper on the night your father supposedly committed treason." Lyra's breath hitched. Silas Crane. She remembered her father speaking of him, a loyal, steadfast soldier who had mysteriously vanished the week after her father's execution. Everyone assumed he had gone rogue. "You've been down here for 10 years, she breathed, horrified. "Alpha Theron Ashford made sure I disappeared," Silas rasped, dragging himself closer to the bars. His eyes were wide, desperate. "I heard the guards talking. I heard them say a Blackwood was brought down. I saw your eyes when you walked past. You have Marcus's eyes." "Silas, what happened that night?" Lyra gripped the cold iron bars, her knuckles turning white. My father didn't let those rogues in. He couldn't have. He loved the old king. He didn't, Silas confirmed, his voice dropping to a frantic whisper. It was Ashford. Alpha Theron Ashford orchestrated the entire breach. He used the Iron Ridge supply trucks to smuggle the rogues past the outer perimeters. He wanted the old king dead to install a puppet monarch. But why frame my father? Because Marcus found out, Silas wheezed. Your father discovered the smuggling ledgers. He was going to present them to the council the very next morning. Theron acted first. He opened the gates, let the slaughter happen, and planted forged communications in Marcus's study. I was on the gate. I saw Theron's men cut the perimeter wires. When I tried to report it, they took me. They locked me down here beneath the radar, keeping me alive only to occasionally torture me for the location of Marcus's proof. Lyra's mind spun. The pieces of a decade-old nightmare finally clicked into place. The proof, Lyra said urgently. The ledgers. Did my father hide them? Yes, Silas said, reaching through the bars with a trembling, skeletal hand. He told me he hid them where the wolves of the council would never think to look. He said he buried them at the roots of his greatest creation. Before Lyra could ask what that meant, the heavy iron door at the top of the dungeon stairs groaned open. Heavy, purposeful footsteps began to descend. Quiet, Silas hissed, scrambling backward into the darkest corner of his cell. The king is coming. Do not tell him about me yet, Lyra. His inner circle is compromised. You don't know who you can trust. The scent hit her first. Petrichor cedarwood and the dark, spicy bite of amber. It washed over the stagnant air of the dungeon, sending a jolt of pure instinctual electricity straight to Lyra's core. Kaine Thornwood stepped into the flickering light of the corridor. He had discarded his tuxedo jacket. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to expose the thick corded muscles of his forearms. He looked unhinged. The composed, untouchable Alpha King from the ballroom was gone, replaced by a predator fighting a losing battle against his own biology. He stopped in front of her cell, his hands gripping the bars so tightly the iron groaned under his unnatural strength. His amber eyes burned with a mixture of raw fury and undeniable agonizing longing. How did you do it? Kaine demanded, his voice a low, lethal vibration. Lyra stood up, refusing to cower. I didn't do anything, Your Majesty. I attended your mandated banquet. I sat where I was told. I bled over the silk of a dress I can't afford just to appease your counsel. Do not lie to me, Kaine roared, striking the bars. The deafening clang made Lyra flinch. A mate bond with a traitor's daughter. It's a statistical impossibility. The Ashfords warned me there were remnants of the Holt Coven working in the outer territories. Tell me what hex you placed on me. Give me the counter curse, and I might let you live. You are blind, Lyra shot back, her own anger finally shattering her fear. She stepped right up to the bars, standing mere inches from him. The proximity was intoxicating. Every nerve ending in her body screamed to close the remaining distance, to press her hands against his chest to let her wolf submit to her fated mate. You are supposedly the most powerful alpha in North America. Yet you let the Ashfords feed you lies while they hold your leash. Kaine's nostrils flared, his eyes dropping to her lips before snapping back to her eyes. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling in jagged rhythms. Watch your tongue, Omega. I am not an Omega. I am a Blackwood, Lyra said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. And my father was framed. The very people you are protecting, the people you are considering marrying into, they are the ones who murdered your father. Kaine froze. The air between them grew dangerously still. What did you just say? Your father's death, my father's execution. It was a coup, Lyra said, using his given name without thinking, and the sound of it on her lips made his pupils dilate until his eyes were nearly black. Alpha Theron Ashford orchestrated the breach. He used his human logistics company to smuggle the rogues. My father found out, and he was silenced. Lies, Kaine growled, though the absolute certainty in his voice wavered. You have no proof, only the desperate stories of a disgraced bloodline. Oh, I can get the proof, Lyra pleaded, pressing her hands against the cold iron, intentionally mirroring where his hands gripped the metal. Just give me time. Let me show you. A sharp metallic shink echoed in the corridor. Kaine's head whipped around his acute alpha hearing, picking up the sound a fraction of a second before the attack. A guard one of the men Callum had left stationed at the top of the stairs was suddenly behind them. The man wasn't holding a standard-issue baton. He held a sleek, heavily modified crossbow loaded with a silver-tipped bolt. Sorry, Your Majesty, the rogue guard muttered, his eyes cold and dead. Alpha Ashford sends his regards. The girl cannot be allowed to speak. The guard pulled the trigger. Time seemed to slow. The bolt tore through the damp air, aimed directly at Lyra's chest through the bars. Kaine didn't think. He didn't weigh the political consequences or the logic of protecting a supposed traitor. His inner wolf, completely consumed by the driving violent need to protect its mate, took absolute control. With a feral roar, Kaine lunged sideways. He threw his massive body between the bars and the incoming projectile. The silver bolt struck Kaine deep in the back of his right shoulder. He grunted a harsh sound of pain as the toxic silver immediately began burning his lichened flesh. But he didn't fall. Spinning with terrifying speed, Kaine reached out, grabbed the rogue guard by the throat, and slammed him brutally against the stone wall. The sickening crack of the assassin's neck breaking echoed through the dungeon, and the man slumped lifelessly to the floor. Kaine staggered, his hand flying to the bolt embedded in his shoulder. Silver poisoning was fast, aggressive, and incredibly painful even for an Alpha King. He dropped to one knee, his breathing ragged. "Kaine." Lyra screamed, her hands reaching through the bars. "Keys! Check his belt for the keys!" Kaine gritted his teeth, his amber eyes clouded with pain. He fumbled blindly at the dead guard's waist, his fingers slick with his own blood, until he found the heavy iron keyring. He tossed them toward Lyra's cell. They slid across the stone, stopping just within her reach. Lyra snatched them up, her hands shaking violently as she jammed the key into the lock. The heavy door swung open and she dropped to her knees beside him. "Don't touch the bolt," Kaine choked out, his muscles spasming as the silver burned its way into his bloodstream. "It'll burn you too." "I don't care," Lyra said fiercely. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed the bloody shaft of the crossbow bolt. The silver immediately seared her palms, blistering the skin, but she gritted her teeth, braced her knee against his broad back, and yanked hard. The bolt came free with a sickening squelch. Kaine let out a guttural roar, pitching forward. Lyra caught him bearing his massive weight as they both collapsed against the cold stone floor. He was breathing hard, his face buried in the crook of her neck. And then it happened. As Lyra held him, her bloodied, blistered hands pressing against his feverish skin, the mate bond fully ignited. It was no longer an ache. It was a blinding, rushing torrent of radiant energy. It surged from Lyra into Kaine instantly, accelerating his lichen healing. The blackened, burning flesh around his wound began to knit together before her very eyes. The silver poison neutralized by the pure, unadulterated power of a true mate's touch. Kaine's breathing slowed. He slowly lifted his head from her neck, his nose brushing against her jawline. He inhaled deeply, filling his lungs with her scent. The ice, the anger, the political walls he had built around himself for years completely shattered. He looked at her, his amber eyes clear, blazing with an ancient, possessive fire. He reached up, his large, blood-stained hand gently cupping her face, his thumb tracing the high arc of her cheekbone. "You're not a witch," he whispered, his voice thick with awe and the terrifying realization of the truth. "You really are mine." Lyra leaned into his touch, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I am. And they are trying to kill us." Kaine's gaze hardened, snapping down to the dead guard wearing his own uniform. The reality of her words crashed over him. His inner circle was compromised. His father's murderers were dining in his ballroom, right above their heads. He helped Lyra to her feet, his hands securely enveloping hers, interlocking their fingers. The raw power radiating from him was no longer oppressive. It felt like a shield. "We need to find that proof," Kaine commanded, his voice returning to the lethal, authoritative tone of a king going to war. He looked down at her, his eyes locking onto hers. "Where did your father bury the ledgers?" Lyra glanced at the adjacent cell where Silas Crane huddled in the shadows. "We can't leave him." Kaine followed her gaze. The skeletal figure dragged himself into the flickering light. To see a once proud royal guard reduced to a starving prisoner within his own estate was a physical blow to Kaine's pride and his perception of his own reign. He had been blind. He had let the Ashfords line his pockets and stroke his ego while they rotted his kingdom from the inside out. Without a word, Kaine scooped up the heavy iron keyring. He unlocked Silas's cell, the metal groaning in protest. Kaine said, his voice dropping to a low, respectful timbre that commanded both authority and deep regret. "I am sorry, I did not know." "An alpha is only as strong as his circle, your majesty." Silas wheezed, accepting Kaine's extended hand. The king effortlessly pulled the frail man to his feet, supporting his weight against his uninjured shoulder. "And yours is a circle of vipers." "Not anymore," Kaine vowed, his amber eyes flashing with lethal intent. He looked at Lyra. "We have to move. If that guard doesn't report back to Morgana or her father within 10 minutes, they'll send down a strike team. We can't fight our way up through the ballroom with Silas in this condition." "There's the smuggler's grate," Silas rasped, pointing a trembling finger toward the far end of the corridor, where the stone floor met a rusted iron drainage pipe. The old king had it installed during the Rogue Wars to move high-value assets out of the estate undetected. It leads directly to the auxiliary motor pool. Kaine nodded sharply. He stripped off his ruined, blood-soaked tuxedo shirt, leaving him in only a white undershirt that clung to the heavy musculature of his chest and the angry pink scar tissue where Lyra had pulled the silver bolt from his flesh. He tossed the ruined garment over the dead assassin's face. They moved quickly. Kaine kicked the rusted grate inward with a single sickening crunch of metal. The tunnel was damp and suffocatingly narrow, smelling of motor oil and stagnant rainwater. Kaine went first, pulling Silas along, while Lyra covered their rear, her senses on high alert. The mate bond thrummed beneath Lyra's skin, a steady electric current connecting her to Kaine. Every time he tensed, she felt it. Every surge of protective adrenaline he experienced washed over her own mind. It was overwhelming, terrifying, and the most profoundly right thing she had ever felt. They emerged 10 minutes later into the cavernous, dimly lit expanse of the estate's auxiliary garage. A dozen luxury vehicles sat gleaming in the shadows. "Take the matte black Land Rover," Silas whispered, leaning heavily against a concrete pillar. "It belongs to Callum. It's analog. No GPS tracking, no royal telematics for the Ashfords to hack." "Smart," Kaine grunted. He punched the code into the lockbox on the wall, grabbed the keys, and ushered them inside. He practically threw Silas into the backseat before turning to Lyra. He paused, his large hands gripping her waist. He looked down at her stained emerald dress, her blistered palms, and the fierce, unyielding set of her jaw. "You saved my life," Kaine murmured, the gravel in his voice scraping against her senses. He brought her injured hands to his lips, kissing the bruised, silver-burned flesh with agonizing tenderness. "You took a silver bolt for me first," Lyra replied, her breath catching as his lips brushed her skin. "We're even." "We are far from even, little wolf," he promised, his eyes darkening. "But right now I need you to navigate. Where are we going?" "The Cascade Wilderness Reserve," Lyra said, sliding into the passenger seat as Kaine fired up the roaring engine. "To the outer territories, the botanical sanctuary where I was banished, to my father's greatest creation." Kaine slammed the Land Rover into gear. They peeled out of the garage, the heavy tires spitting gravel as they bypassed the heavily guarded main gates, crashing through a chained-off service road that vanished into the dense, foggy pines of the Pacific Northwest. As they merged onto the desolate stretch of Highway 101, the rain began to fall in heavy driving sheets. The wipers fought a losing battle against the Pacific Northwest deluge. Highway 101 stretched before them like a dark ribbon, cutting through endless walls of ancient pine, the asphalt slick and treacherous beneath the Land Rover's tires. In the rearview mirror, Shadowpine Manor's lights had long since vanished into the fog. Kaine's knuckles were white against the steering wheel. His jaw worked rhythmically, processing the seismic shift that had occurred in the last hour. Beside him, Lyra stared out at the impenetrable blackness of the forest, her blistered palms resting carefully in her lap. In the back seat, Silas Crane's labored breathing was the only sound competing with the storm. "Marcus's greatest creation," Kaine finally said, breaking the heavy silence. The miles blurred past in sheets of rain. "What is it? A weapon? A vault?" Lyra shook her head, still watching the tree line. "My father wasn't just a tactician, he was a botanist at heart. He believed the strength of the lichens came from the earth, not from steel or politics." She paused, her voice softening. "When I was born, he spent 5 years cross-pollinating a rare ancient species of weeping willow with a mountain ash." From the back seat, Silas let out a dry, knowing chuckle. "Vivian's sanctuary willow, named after your mother." "Yes," Lyra said softly. "It's the only one of its kind in the world. Its leaves turn pure silver in the moonlight, and its roots are strong enough to crack bedrock. If my father had secrets he wanted buried forever, he would have entrusted them to the willow." Kaine glanced at her, the hard lines of his face softening in the dim dashboard light. "Then we dig." Headlights suddenly flared in the rearview mirror. 2 sets cutting through the rain-soaked darkness, closing the distance with alarming speed. "We have company," Kaine said, his voice dropping into the lethal calm of a predator preparing for confrontation. Silas struggled to sit up, peering through the rear window. "Ashford mercenaries. They must have had a backup team stationed outside the estate perimeter." The pursuing SUVs accelerated, their high-powered engines roaring even through the storm. They were military-grade vehicles modified for pursuit, gaining ground on every curve. Lyra's heart hammered. "There's an old ranger station 12 miles ahead. Fire access road. We can lose them in the logging trails." Kaine's amber eyes flashed with feral intelligence. "Hold on." He waited until the lead SUV was mere yards from their bumper, its spotlight flooding the Land Rover's interior with harsh white light. Then with the supernatural reflexes of an alpha king, Kaine cut the wheel hard right. The Land Rover's tires screamed in protest as they fishtailed onto a barely visible dirt track. Branches scraped against the windows like skeletal fingers. The pursuing vehicles overshot the turn, their brake lights flaring red in the rain, before they began the laborious process of backing up and repositioning. Kaine killed the headlights, navigating by moonlight and instinct alone. The fire road was rutted and treacherous, climbing steeply into the dense forest. Behind them, the mercenaries' spotlights swept frantically through the trees, searching. 3 minutes later, Kaine coasted the Land Rover into the overgrown clearing of an abandoned ranger station. The structure was barely standing, its roof partially collapsed, windows long since shattered. But it was sheltered by a dense canopy of Douglas fir invisible from the main road. He cut the engine. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic drum of rain on the metal roof and their own ragged breathing. They sat motionless for 5 agonizing minutes, watching the sweep of distant spotlights on Highway 101. Finally, the pursuit vehicles gave up their lights, receding into the storm. "They'll regroup," Kaine said quietly. "We have maybe an hour before they expand the search grid." He turned to Lyra, and for the first time since they'd fled, the adrenaline began to drain from his system. The mate bond pulsed between them, no longer a source of confusion or denial, but an anchor in the chaos. "Lyra," he said, his voice rough with emotion he'd been suppressing. "I need to tell you something." She looked at him, her silver gray eyes luminous in the darkness. "I signed your father's execution order without reading the evidence." Kaine confessed, the words tearing out of him like shrapnel. "I was 22 years old, newly crowned, terrified of looking weak in front of the council. Theron Ashford stood in my war room and said, 'A strong king acts swiftly and decisively. Hesitation is weakness.' I believed him." Kaine's hands were shaking. He gripped the steering wheel to still them. "I killed an innocent man. I destroyed your life. And for 10 years I've been so focused on maintaining control, on proving I was strong enough to lead, that I never questioned the people who put me on this path." He turned to face her fully, his amber eyes blazing with anguish. "I'm sorry, Lyra. I failed your father. I failed you." Lyra reached out, placing her hand over his. The contact sent a warm pulse of luminous energy through the bond. "You were manipulated," she said quietly. "They've been playing you since you took the throne. Theron Ashford is a master at finding people's weaknesses and exploiting them. But Kaine, you're seeing clearly now. That's what matters." "I should have seen it sooner." "My father would have understood," Lyra said, her voice thick with emotion. "He believed in second chances. He believed people could choose to do better to be better." A tear slipped down her cheek. "You're choosing now. That's what he would have wanted." Kaine reached up, cupping her face with his large hand, his thumb gently brushing away the tear. The mate bond flared between them, a tangible warmth that pushed back against the cold reality of their situation. "When I walked into that ballroom tonight," Kaine said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "I felt the bond before I even saw you. My wolf was screaming to find you, to claim you, to protect you. But I let politics and fear and pride override every instinct. I hurt you in front of 400 witnesses because I was too much of a coward to face what the moon goddess had given me." "You're facing it now," Lyra whispered back. Kaine leaned in slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. When she didn't, when she instead tilted her face up to meet him, he closed the distance. The kiss was tender at first, achingly gentle, a stark contrast to the violence and chaos of the night. But then the mate bond surged, and the kiss deepened. It was desperate and healing all at once, a claim and an apology, a promise written in the language of touch. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Kaine rested his forehead against hers. "We finished this together," he murmured. "No more running, no more hiding." From the back seat, Silas cleared his throat weakly. "If you two are done having your moment, I should probably tell you the rest of what I know about Theron's operation." Kaine and Lyra pulled apart reluctantly. Kaine shifted in his seat to face the emaciated guard. "Talk!" Kaine commanded, his voice returning to the authoritative tone of a king, though his hand remained firmly clasped with Lyra's. Silas took a shuddering breath. "Iron Ridge Supply Corporation isn't just smuggling rogues. They've been running weapons to human militia groups across 3 states. Theron's plan was never just about killing the old king. It was about destabilizing Lycan territories so he could position himself as the solution." "Extortion," Kaine growled. "Create the problem, sell the protection." "Exactly," Silas confirmed. "He's been inflating border security contracts for years, skimming millions off the top. The old king started to suspect something was wrong when the breach incidents kept increasing despite the budget increases. He ordered an audit of all external contracts. And my father was the one conducting the audit, Lyra said, the pieces clicking into place. Silas nodded. Marcus found the Iron Ridge financial ledgers during a routine inspection. Millions of dollars flowing to shell companies, mercenary groups, rogue syndicates. He took the evidence straight to the old king's chambers the night of the breach. Silas's voice cracked. I watched him run through the halls carrying those ledgers. He was trying to save everyone, but the attack had already started. Theron timed it perfectly. Kaine said, his fury building like a physical force in the confined space. The old king dies in the chaos. Marcus gets framed with planted evidence, and a 22-year-old heir takes the throne traumatized and desperate for guidance. Which Theron was more than happy to provide, Silas said bitterly. I tried to report what I saw, the wire cutting the mercenaries in Ashford colors, but Theron's men grabbed me before I could reach the council chambers. They dragged me down to those cells, and they've kept me there ever since, torturing me periodically for the location of Marcus's backup evidence. But you never told them, Lyra said softly. I didn't know, Silas admitted. Marcus only told me it was buried at the roots of his greatest creation. I didn't know about the willow until tonight when I heard you describe it to the king. Kaine's jaw worked. How many others? How many others are in Theron's pocket? I don't know for certain, Silas said, but assume the Eastern Ridge delegation is compromised. Maybe a third of the council alphas have financial ties to Iron Ridge. And there are likely other guards, other staff who've been bought or blackmailed. The implications were staggering. Kaine had been ruling a kingdom that was rotting from within, surrounded by vipers who smiled to his face while plotting his downfall. We need those ledgers, Kaine said, starting the engine again. Once we have hard evidence, I can purge the council. But without it, it's your word against Theron's, and he has too many allies. Then let's go get them, Lyra said. They pulled back onto the fire road, moving slowly without headlights, until they were far enough from the highway to risk drawing attention. The storm was beginning to ease the rain, settling into a steady drizzle as they descended from the mountains toward the coastal wilderness reserve. By the time they reached the sanctuary, the moon was high, casting a pale, ghostly glow over the mist-choked valley. The outer territories were vastly different from the manicured lawns of Shadowpine Manor. Here, nature was untamed, feral, and aggressively beautiful. Lyra directed Kaine down a deeply rutted dirt road that ended at a sprawling, dilapidated greenhouse complex. The glass panels were thick with moss, and the air smelled fiercely of wet earth, blooming nightshade, and pine needles. They helped Silas out of the vehicle. The old guard was running on pure adrenaline, now his eyes locked onto the massive silhouette looming behind the largest greenhouse. There it is, Silas breathed. It was breathtaking. Vivian's sanctuary willow stood nearly 80 feet tall, its massive sweeping branches draped in long, delicate leaves that literally shimmered like liquid silver beneath the moonlight. The trunk was thick and gnarled, a testament to its deep, unyielding roots. Even in the darkness, even battered by rain and wind, the tree radiated an almost otherworldly beauty. It's magnificent, Kaine murmured, stepping out of the Land Rover. He looked at Lyra, his amber eyes reflecting the silver light. He made this for your mother. He loved her. Lyra said, a tight knot forming in her throat. She walked toward the tree as if drawn by an invisible tether. He spent every spare moment working on the cross-pollination, adjusting soil composition, grafting branches. He said he wanted to create something that would outlive them both, something that would prove love could create beauty even in a world full of violence. Kaine followed close behind, one hand resting protectively on the small of her back. He succeeded. They approached the base of the massive tree. The roots rippled above the soil like thick, muscular serpents before plunging deep into the earth. Lyra dropped to her knees, running her hands over the damp soil between the two largest roots, a spot that formed a natural protective cradle. Here, she said, the soil is loose beneath the moss. Kaine didn't hesitate. He dropped beside her, and without ceremony he began to dig. His massive hands acted as shovels, his lichen strength tearing through the heavy, wet earth, tossing aside rocks and roots that would have taken a human hours to clear. 3 feet down, his claws scraped against something hard and metallic. Kaine's eyes met Lyra's, electric with anticipation. He dug around the object, revealing a heavy titanium lockbox sealed with a biometric thumbprint scanner. He pulled it from the earth, wiping the mud from the surface. The box was roughly the size of a briefcase, military-grade construction designed to survive decades buried underground. It requires a Blackwood, Kaine said, turning it toward Lyra. With trembling hands, Lyra placed her thumb over the scanner. She felt a tiny prick, a needle drawing a single drop of blood, a DNA failsafe her father had engineered. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the box hissed. The pressurized seal broke open with a soft click. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth to protect against moisture, were three thick leather-bound ledgers. A stack of encrypted USB drives military-grade data storage, and a handwritten letter folded carefully and sealed with her father's personal wax stamp. Lyra's hands shook as she carefully unfolded the letter. Her father's neat, tactical handwriting filled the page, and just seeing those familiar loops and strokes made her chest constrict with grief. She read aloud, her voice breaking, "To whoever unearths this, hopefully, my beloved Lyra, when you are old enough to understand. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and the truth has been buried along with me. The Eastern Ridge Pack is compromised. Alpha Theron Ashford has sold our borders to human mercenaries through his shell corporation, Iron Ridge Supply. He plans to assassinate the king and frame me to ensure the tactical division falls under his command. The proof of his treason, his wire transfers, his direct orders to the rogue syndicates are contained in these ledgers. I have documented everything, every payment, every shipment, every communication. Do not trust the council. Many have been bought. Trust only the wolves who remember the old ways. Trust those who value honor above gold. Lyra, if you are reading this, I am so sorry I could not protect you from what is to come. But I need you to know I fought to the end. I loved you and your mother more than breath itself. Clear our name. Restore our honor. The willow will protect you as I could not. Your father, Marcus Blackwood." Tears streamed down Lyra's face. Kaine pulled her against his chest, holding her as she wept, letting her grieve the father she'd lost in the childhood that had been stolen from her. Silas, leaning heavily against the trunk of the willow, bowed his head in respect. After a long moment, Lyra pulled back, wiping her eyes. "We need to see what's in the ledgers." Kaine flipped open the first leather-bound book. Even in the moonlight, the meticulous records were clear. Page after page of wire transfers. Millions of dollars flowing from Ashford family accounts to known rogue syndicates, to human mercenary companies, to offshore shell corporations. The dates were damning. Payments began 3 years before the old king's assassination and continued right up until the week before Marcus's execution. He paid them to slaughter his own people. Kaine breathed, his voice shaking with barely contained rage. "He paid them to kill my father." "It's all here," Silas said, looking over Kaine's shoulder. "Everything we need to prove the conspiracy." Suddenly, a sharp, unnatural sound pierced the serene quiet of the sanctuary. The heavy, rhythmic thud of rotor blades slicing through the fog. Kaine's head snapped up, his ears flattening. "Helicopter, military grade." Two blinding spotlights cut through the mist, illuminating Vivian's sanctuary willow in harsh artificial white light. The heavy downdraft whipped the silver leaves into a frenzy, creating a maelstrom of shimmering metal. "They tracked us," Silas yelled over the deafening roar, covering his face from the flying debris. "I took Callum's analog car," Kaine roared back, his fangs descending as his body began the painful rapid shift toward his partial lichen form. "There were no trackers." "They didn't track the car, Your Majesty." The voice boomed through a megaphone from the edge of the tree line. 4 heavily armored SUVs smashed through the perimeter fencing, their high beams pinning Kaine, Lyra, and Silas against the massive trunk of the tree. The doors slammed open, and a dozen heavily armed mercenaries poured out, wielding rifles loaded with silver nitrate rounds. From the lead SUV stepped a man who could only be Ronan Ashford. He was hulking, scarred, with the cruel, calculating eyes of a professional enforcer. He held a glowing tablet in his hand. "We tracked the king," Ronan sneered, his voice amplified by the megaphone. He tossed the tablet onto the hood of his vehicle, the screen displaying a pulsing GPS dot. "Did you really think my father would let you wear a custom tuxedo, tailored by our people, without weaving a micro GPS thread into the lining of the trousers? You've been on our radar since you left the ballroom." Kaine looked down at his formal pants, fury and realization flooding his features. Ronan's smile widened. "You're not a king anymore, Kaine Brisamana. You're a rogue who kidnapped a poor disgraced Omega and murdered a guard in a manic hex-induced frenzy. That's the story Morgana is telling the council right now. By sunrise, my father will be voted in as interim Alpha King, and you three will be buried in the dirt with Marcus Blackwood's secrets." He raised his hand, signaling the mercenaries to take aim. "Kill them all. Burn the tree to the ground." Lyra clutched the ledgers to her chest, her heart hammering wildly. But as she looked at Kaine's broad back, standing as an impenetrable shield between her and a dozen guns, she didn't feel fear. The mate bond flared a blinding, white-hot inferno in her mind. She wasn't just a botanist anymore. She was the fated Luna of the most powerful Alpha in a century, and she refused to watch her mate die in the dirt. "Kaine," Lyra whispered, her silver eyes glowing with a sudden feral light as she reached out and placed her hand flat against his spine. "Let them come. The Alpha King roared. The moment Lyra's palm pressed flat against the scarred expanse of Kaine's spine, the world seemed to hold its breath. The mate bond, previously a warm current, erupted into a supernova of radiant kinetic force. It was not just an emotional tether. It was an ancient biological amplifier designed by the moon goddess to protect the apex of their species. Kaine's roar shook the damp needles from the surrounding pines. His body violently expanded, muscles tearing through the remains of his human clothing as he shifted into his partial lichen form. A terrifying 8-foot-tall hybrid of man and wolf coated in midnight black fur with eyes that burned like twin suns. "Fire, put him down!" Ronan screamed, leveling his customized assault rifle. A deafening barrage of gunfire shattered the serenity of the sanctuary. Dozens of silver nitrate rounds tore through the mist aimed directly at the Alpha King. But the mercenaries had fundamentally miscalculated two things: the speed of a fully bonded alpha and the defensive anomaly of Marcus Blackwood's greatest creation. As the bullets flew, the downdraft from the hovering mercenary helicopter whipped the sweeping silver leaves of Vivian's sanctuary willow into a blinding vortex. The moonlight, reflecting off the genetically modified botanical silver, acted like a massive strobe light, instantly overloading and shorting out the expensive military-grade night vision goggles worn by Ronan's men. Blinded and disoriented, the mercenaries fired wildly into the trunk of the tree. The roots, thick as steel cables, absorbed the impact, protecting Lyra and Silas, who crouched securely in the Earth's natural cradle, clutching the waterproof USB drives and the leather ledgers. Kaine moved faster than human eyes could track. He was a shadow of vengeance tearing through the fog. He didn't bother with strategic disarming. He was pure primal fury. He struck the first mercenary with enough force to shatter the man's Kevlar plating, sending him flying into the hood of an SUV with a sickening crunch. He ripped the rifle from another, snapping the reinforced barrel in half like a dry twig before throwing the heavy metal into the rotor blades of the low-hanging helicopter. Sparks showered the clearing as the chopper's engine whined in distress, forcing the pilot to sharply pull up and retreat into the cloud cover, abandoning the ground crew. Within 90 seconds, 11 highly trained mercenaries lay groaning or unconscious in the mud. Only Ronan remained. Panic completely erased the cruel smirk from Ronan's face. He backed away, his boots slipping in the wet earth, frantically trying to reload his jammed weapon. Kaine stalked toward him, the heavy thud of his clawed feet vibrating through the soil. The Alpha King's black fur was matted with rain and the blood of his enemies, but he was entirely uninjured. The sunlit current from Lyra's touch still pulsed visibly beneath his skin, rendering the ambient silver dust in the air completely harmless to him. "Wait!" Ronan choked out, dropping his useless rifle and raising his hands in a pathetic display of surrender. "Kaine, please. My father ordered this. I was just following the Alpha's command." Kaine closed the distance in a single bound, his massive clawed hand wrapping around Ronan's throat. He lifted the hulking enforcer 3 feet off the ground, Ronan's legs kicking uselessly in the air. "Your father is no Alpha." Kaine's voice was a terrifying, dual-layered rumble, man and beast speaking as one. "And you are out of time." Before Kaine could snap the traitor's neck, a booming voice echoed over a loudspeaker from the sky. "Stand down. By order of the Royal Guard, drop your weapons." A massive black and silver Black Hawk helicopter, painted in the matte colors and crest of the Royal Fleet, descended rapidly into the clearing. Its powerful searchlights pinned Ronan's remaining SUVs. The side doors slid open and a dozen elite Royal Guards rappelled to the ground, heavily armed and moving with precise, lethal efficiency. Leading them was Callum Redstone. Callum sprinted toward the tree, taking in the carnage, the unconscious mercenaries, and the terrifying, magnificent form of his fully shifted king. "Your Majesty," Callum shouted over the roar of the rotors. He stopped a respectful distance away, lowering his weapon. "We detected an unauthorized encrypted micro-GPS frequency pinging from your Royal Wardrobe servers to the Eastern Ridge estate. We traced the relay here. I apologize for the delay." Kaine's glowing eyes flicked from the struggling Ronan to Callum, then finally to the base of the tree. Lyra stepped out from the protective roots. Her emerald dress was ruined, covered in mud and silver dust, but her posture was uncompromisingly regal. She held her father's ledgers tightly against her chest. Kaine slowly exhaled, the beast receding just enough to return to his human form, though his amber eyes remained feral. He dropped Ronan into the mud with a wet thud. "Arrest him," Kaine ordered Callum, gesturing to the gasping Ashford heir. "Bind him with silver chains. We have a banquet to crash." 2 hours later, the grand ballroom of Shadowpine Manor was in a state of chaotic transition. The music had stopped. The elegant tables were in disarray. Alpha Theron Ashford stood at the elevated royal dais, flanked by his daughter Morgana, addressing the panicked crowd of regional leaders who had remained after Kaine's disappearance. "We must maintain order," Theron shouted, banging his fist on the podium. His voice carried the practiced authority of a seasoned manipulator. "The king has succumbed to a dark magic hex placed by the traitor Blackwood's daughter. He has murdered a guard and fled the estate. As the strongest regional alpha and the primary financial supporter of our border security, I am invoking the emergency succession clause outlined in..." The massive reinforced oak doors of the ballroom did not just open. They were violently blown off their iron hinges, crashing to the marble floor with a sound like a bomb detonating. The entire room went dead silent. Kaine Thornwood strode into the ballroom. He was shirtless, his torso covered in mud rain and dried blood. His formal trousers were torn and stained, but the aura of absolute crushing dominance radiating from him was so overwhelming that half the room immediately dropped to their knees in involuntary submission. Beside him walked Lyra Blackwood, her head held high, completely unbothered by the stares of the elite. Her ruined emerald dress and blistered hands only seemed to enhance the fierce, unbreakable quality of her presence. Behind them, Callum Redstone and the Royal Guard dragged a heavily chained, bruised Ronan Ashford. The young Ashford was thrown to the floor at the base of the dais with enough force to crack the marble. "The only thing you are invoking, Theron," Kaine's voice was dangerously calm, carrying easily to the back of the silent room, "is your own execution." Morgana screamed, her perfectly composed mask shattering as she saw her brother bleeding on the floor. Theron's face drained of all color. "This is an outrage. He is bewitched. Guards, seize them." None of the guards moved. They stood frozen, torn between conflicting loyalties until Callum Redstone stepped forward. "Any guard who moves against the king will be tried for treason," Callum announced, his hand resting on his sidearm. Kaine walked straight up to the dais. He took the heavy waterproof USB drives and the weathered leather ledgers from Lyra's hands and slammed them onto the podium right in front of Theron. The sound echoed through the ballroom like a judge's gavel. "The financial records of Iron Ridge Supply Corporation," Kaine announced to the frozen crowd, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Detailed logs of wire transfers to rogue mercenary factions totaling $47 million over 8 years. Signed orders orchestrating the breach that killed my father. All hidden by Marcus Blackwood, a true loyalist who died because he discovered your treason." Kaine turned his blazing amber eyes onto the trembling Alpha. "Your reign is over." Callum connected the USB drives to the ballroom's massive projection screens. Within seconds, the damning evidence filled every surface. Financial ledgers appeared in stark black and white. Perimeter barrage footage played timestamp to match the night of the old king's assassination. The video showed men in Ashford colors, systematically cutting perimeter wires, opening gates, waving through vehicles filled with armed rogues. Encrypted communications scrolled across the screens. Messages between Theron and known mercenary leaders, explicit assassination orders, contingency plans for framing Marcus Blackwood. The council erupted, gasps of horror, shouts of outrage. Regional alphas stood from their tables demanding explanations, their faces contorted with fury and betrayal. Theron backed away from the podium, his carefully constructed empire crumbling in real time. Morgana stepped forward, tears streaming down her perfectly made-up face. "Father, what have you done?" Her voice was a masterwork of feigned shock and betrayal. She turned to the council, her hands clasped in supplication. "I didn't know. He told me Marcus Blackwood was a traitor. He said Kaine was hexed and needed to be protected from dark magic." She fell to her knees before Kaine, her designer gown pooling around her. "Your Majesty, please. I was manipulated just like you were. My father used me as a pawn. I loved you. I would never knowingly participate in enough." The single word came from Queen Dowager Seraphina. The old woman stepped forward from the shadows where she had been observing her silver-tipped cane, tapping against the marble with each measured step. She placed her gnarled hand on top of Morgana's perfectly coiffed head. Morgana's eyes went wide with panic. "No, please." Seraphina's blind eyes suddenly erupted with brilliant silver light. The supernatural glow filled the ballroom, and a holographic projection materialized above them, visible to every witness. The seer vision showed a memory pulled directly from Morgana's mind and displayed for all to see. The scene was Theron's private study 2 weeks before the solstice banquet. Morgana sat across from her father, her expression cold and calculating, utterly devoid of the innocent victim persona she was currently projecting. "If the Blackwood girl triggers the mate bond," holographic Morgana said, her voice dripping with venom, "we destroy her immediately. No hesitation." "Already arranged," holographic Theron replied, sliding a document across his desk. I have a guard in the dungeons on my payroll. If the bond activates and Kaine brings her down there, the guard will execute her with a silver bolt. It will look like Kaine killed her in a rage, further evidence of the hex. The holographic Morgana smiled. And if Kaine protects her, then we activate the tracker in his formal wear and send Ronan with a strike team. Either way, the Blackwood line ends and you become Luna by default. The hologram showed Morgana leaving the study meeting with the rogue guard in a shadowed corridor, coaching him on the exact angle to aim for maximum lethality, handing him the modified crossbow. The projection faded. The ballroom erupted into chaos. Regional alphas who had been considering supporting Theron's succession claimed now looked physically ill. Morgana's mask was gone. Her true face, cruel and cunning, was exposed for all to see. She lunged to her feet, abandoning all pretense of innocence. "You stole my destiny!" she shrieked at Lyra, her voice raw with genuine fury. "I was supposed to be Luna. I was groomed for this. Since childhood, I am the daughter of an alpha. You are nobody, a disgraced servant living in a greenhouse." Lyra stepped forward. This was the first time since the champagne humiliation that she had directly addressed Morgana. "You poured champagne on my dress," Lyra said, her voice calm but carrying clearly through the ballroom. "You called me traitor's spawn. You smiled when I was dragged to the dungeon. You knew exactly what you were doing." Morgana snarled, her canines extending. "You don't deserve him. You don't deserve any of this." "I'm Marcus Blackwood's daughter," Lyra said, her silver eyes blazing, "and I'm the woman who brought your empire down." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Kaine raised his hand and the ballroom fell silent. "Alpha Theron Ashford Morgana Ashford, you are hereby stripped of all titles, lands, and assets. You are charged with regicide conspiracy to commit murder treason against the North American Lycan Council and crimes against the Pack." He turned to the assembled council. "I call for immediate sentencing, all in favor of guilt." 400 hands rose. The vote was unanimous. "Execution for Theron Ashford to be carried out at the next full moon," Kaine pronounced. "Life imprisonment for Morgana Ashford, exiled to the Arctic penal colony, stripped of Lycan rights. Ronan Ashford, 50 years of silver-chained labor in the border mines." Callum's guards moved forward, seizing the Ashfords. Theron struggled, shouting incoherently about empires and modernization and weak kings. Morgana wailed, her perfectly constructed life disintegrating. As they were dragged away, Kaine turned to address the council. Marcus Blackwood was innocent, a loyal tactician murdered for discovering treason. His daughter, Lyra Blackwood, risked her life to bring the truth to light. He extended his hand to her, and she stepped onto the dais beside him. "She is my fated mate, chosen by the moon goddess herself. Any who object may challenge me now." Silence. Then an elderly council member from the Western Territories stood. He bowed his head in respect. "We were wrong, Your Majesty," he said, his voice thick with genuine remorse. "We owe the Blackwood family a debt that can never be repaid." One by one, 400 werewolves stood. One by one, they bowed to Lyra Blackwood. The outcast who sat alone at table 47 had become Luna. The 3 weeks following the ballroom confrontation passed in a blur of council sessions, interrogations, and the systematic dismantling of the Ashford Empire. Theron and Morgana remained in silver-reinforced cells beneath Shadowpine Manor, awaiting the full moon that would bring Theron's execution. Lyra stood at the window of Kaine's private chambers, watching the forest beyond the estate grounds. The room had become theirs, though she still sometimes woke in the night, disoriented, half expecting to find herself back in the crumbling greenhouse. Strong arms wrapped around her waist from behind. Kaine rested his chin on her shoulder, his warmth a constant anchor. "You should eat something," he murmured against her neck. "The coronation is in 4 hours." Lyra leaned back into his embrace. "I'm not hungry, I'm nervous." You faced down a dozen armed mercenaries without flinching. You stared down Morgana Ashford in front of the entire council. But a ceremony makes you nervous. "Those were survival situations," Lyra said quietly. "This is different. This is standing in front of everyone who watched me get dragged to the dungeons and accepting a crown. What if they're only bowing because you commanded it?" Kaine turned her around to face him, his amber eyes serious. "They bow because you earned their respect. You brought down a conspiracy that had been poisoning this kingdom for a decade. You saved my life. You saved all of us." He cupped her face gently. "And if anyone still doubts, they'll learn. You are exactly what this kingdom needs." A knock at the door interrupted them. Callum Redstone entered, followed by 2 guards escorting Silas Crane. The former prisoner looked almost unrecognizable. 3 weeks of proper nutrition, medical care, and rest had returned color to his face. He wore the formal uniform of the royal guard, the fabric crisp and new. "Your Majesty, Luna," Silas said, bowing respectfully. "I wanted to speak with you before the ceremony." "Of course," Kaine said. "What is it?" Silas remained standing, his weathered hands clasped behind his back in military posture. "I wanted to thank you. For 10 years I believed I would die in that cell, that Marcus's sacrifice would be for nothing." His voice thickened with emotion. "You gave me my life back. You cleared Marcus's name, and you've appointed me to a position I never thought I'd hold again." Lyra stood and crossed to him, placing a hand on his arm. "You kept my father's secret even under torture. You never broke. He would be grateful, Silas." "I hope so," Silas said quietly. "I failed him that night. I should have reported the wire cutting immediately." "You survived," Lyra interrupted firmly. "You survived so you could testify, so you could help us expose the truth. That's what my father would have wanted." Silas's eyes were bright. "I will serve House Blackwood until my last breath, Luna. That's a promise." The Luna coronation ceremony was held in the same grand ballroom where Lyra had sat alone at table 47. But the space had been transformed. Where once there had been tables arranged in hierarchical order, now there were neat rows of chairs facing a raised platform. Silver and emerald banners, the colors of House Blackwood, hung alongside the traditional royal crimson and gold. The symbolism was deliberate. This was not just a coronation. It was a vindication. Lyra waited in the antechamber wearing a gown commissioned specifically for this moment. The fabric was a unique shade the seamstress had called Blackwood silver, matching perfectly the leaves of Vivian's sanctuary willow. The cut was elegant but strong, designed for a Luna who had fought for her crown. Queen Dowager Seraphina entered the antechamber, moving slowly with her silver-tipped cane. Her blind eye was covered with a silk patch today. "You look like your mother," Seraphina said, studying Lyra. Vivian had that same fierce quality, that same refusal to be diminished by the world's cruelty. "You knew my mother?" Lyra asked, surprised. "I knew both your parents," Seraphina replied. "Marcus consulted me before he proposed to Vivian. He wanted to know if the moon goddess approved of their match." She smiled faintly. "I told him the goddess doesn't micromanage love affairs, but that his heart was true." That was enough. She reached into her robes and withdrew a small velvet box. "Your mother gave me this for safekeeping many years ago. She said if anything ever happened to her, I should give it to her daughter when she became Luna." Lyra opened the box with trembling hands. Inside was a delicate silver necklace, the pendant carved from petrified wood from the willow tree. "She knew," Lyra whispered. "Vivian was a seer in her own way," Seraphina said, helping Lyra fasten the necklace. "Not with visions like mine, but with hope. She believed the goddess had plans for you." The old woman's expression softened. She was right. The processional music began. Seraphina took Lyra's arm. "One more thing," Seraphina murmured as they paused at the threshold. "Your father watches from the spirit realm. He smiles tonight." The doors opened. 400 werewolves rose to their feet as one. Lyra walked down the aisle on Seraphina's arm, her head held high. She saw Callum Redstone standing at attention with the royal guard. Silas Crane, tears streaming down his weathered face. Regional alphas who had once looked through her, now watching with respect. And at the end of the aisle, standing beside the ornate Luna's throne, was Kaine. He wore full ceremonial regalia, but his eyes were only for her. The mate bond hummed between them, a sacred thread that grew stronger with each step. When she reached the platform, Seraphina transferred Lyra's hand to Kaine's. Kaine guided Lyra to stand before the throne. The room fell silent. 10 years ago, Kaine's voice rang out clear and strong. A great injustice was committed within these walls. Marcus Blackwood, chief strategist and loyal servant of the crown, was falsely accused and executed for treason. His daughter was stripped of her rank and banished. His name was dragged through mud and lies. He turned to face the assembled council. "We have spent these past weeks investigating the full extent of the Ashford conspiracy. 23 high-ranking officials were on Theron Ashford's payroll. 14 border stations were compromised. $89 million were embezzled from our security budgets and funneled to mercenary groups who attacked our own people." Shocked murmurs rippled through the crowd. "But tonight is not about dwelling on darkness," Kaine continued. "Tonight is about honoring the light that exposed it. Tonight is about recognizing the courage and unbreakable spirit of the woman who saved this kingdom." He extended his hand to Lyra. Lyra Blackwood could have fled when she discovered the truth. Instead, she risked everything. She endured imprisonment, assassination attempts, and a harrowing journey through hostile territory to bring justice to light. Kaine turned back to her, his amber eyes blazing with pride and love. "The moon goddess chose her as my fated mate, but I choose her as my Luna because of who she is. Because she is brave and brilliant and refuses to let evil triumph. Because she represents everything this kingdom should be, resilient, honorable, and true. Serafina stepped forward, carrying the Luna's crown on a velvet cushion. It was elegant in its simplicity, wrought from silver and set with moonstones that caught the light like captured starlight. Lyra Blackwood. Serafina's voice carried the weight of centuries of tradition. Daughter of Marcus and Vivian, do you accept the responsibilities of Luna? Do you swear to protect the pact, to counsel the king with wisdom, to stand as guardian of honor and truth? I do, Lyra said, her voice steady and clear. Serafina placed the crown upon Lyra's head. The moment it settled, the mate bond flared with brilliant, luminous light, visible to every wolf in the room. The goddess's seal of approval, unmistakable and undeniable. Luna Lyra, Serafina proclaimed, keeper of truth, guardian of honor, chosen of the moon goddess. The council erupted, not with polite applause, but with genuine thunderous celebration. Wolves howled, the ancient sound of approval rising to the vaulted ceiling. Kaine pulled Lyra into his arms and kissed her, unmindful of the 400 witnesses. When they finally broke apart, he whispered against her lips, welcome home, Luna. The full moon hung heavy and luminous over the Cascade Wilderness Reserve. Kaine and Lyra stood hand in hand beneath the sweeping branches of Vivian's sanctuary willow, the silver leaves creating a canopy of liquid moonlight above them. Lyra carried a small memorial stone carved from granite and engraved with her father's name. She knelt at the base of the tree, placing it carefully among the massive roots where they had unearthed the evidence that had changed everything. The inscription read simply, Marcus Blackwood, loyal strategist, beloved father, true guardian, vindicated. Kaine knelt beside her, placing his hand over the stone. For a long moment he said nothing, just traced the engraved letters with his thumb. I wish I'd known him as you did, he finally whispered. You honor him in everything you do, Lyra said softly, drawing comfort from his solid presence. The reforms you've implemented, the investigations, the new security protocols based on his original proposals. All of it honors his memory better than any monument could. They sat in silence, listening to the wind rustle through the silver leaves. Finally, Kaine reached into his jacket and withdrew a small velvet box. Lyra's breath caught as he opened it, revealing a ring unlike any she had ever seen. The band was crafted from a thin piece of silver willow bark, preserved and treated to be as strong as metal. Set into it was a moonstone that seemed to glow from within. I had this made from a fallen branch of the willow, Kaine explained, his voice rough with emotion. I wanted you to carry a piece of your father's greatest creation with you always. He took her hand, looking into her eyes with an intensity that made her heart race. I know we're already mated. I know the moon goddess chose us. But Lyra, I need you to know that I choose you too. Not because fate demanded it, not because the kingdom needs a Luna, but because you are brave and brilliant and beautiful, and I cannot imagine spending a single day without you. Tears streamed down Lyra's face as he slid the ring onto her finger. Will you be my partner in all things, Kaine asked? My confidant, my challenger, my equal. Will you help me build a kingdom worthy of your father's sacrifice? Yes, Lyra whispered, pulling him into a kiss. Yes to all of it. The weeks following the execution were devoted to rebuilding. Kaine and Lyra worked tirelessly, restructuring the kingdom's security apparatus. They implemented every one of Marcus Blackwood's original security proposals, the strategic innovations that had been ignored and suppressed. The Iron Ridge Supply Corporation was dismantled. Its assets totaling $89 million were liquidated. The money was distributed to the families of victims. Lyra insisted on delivering the reparations personally. One crisp autumn morning, she stood on the porch of a small house in the Oregon Territories, holding an envelope containing a check for $240,000. The door opened. A woman in her 50s stood there, her face lined with grief. Her mate had been killed in the breach that took the old king's life. Luna, the woman said, surprised. I wasn't expecting. I won't take much of your time, Lyra said gently. She held out the envelope. This is from the liquidation of the Ashford assets. It won't bring your mate back. Nothing can, but it's a start toward justice. The woman's hands shook as she took the envelope. She opened it, saw the amount, and her knees buckled. Lyra caught her, helping her to a chair. How? The woman whispered. My father discovered the truth, Lyra said quietly. He died trying to expose it, but his evidence survived. And now finally the people who caused your pain are being held accountable. The woman looked up at Lyra with tears streaming down her face. Your father was Marcus Blackwood. I remember. They said he was a traitor, but I never believed it. He helped train my mate. Marcus was a good man. He was, Lyra agreed, her own voice thick with emotion. I'm so sorry it took 10 years to prove it. The woman stood and pulled Lyra into a tight embrace. Thank you. Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for fighting for the truth. 6 months after the coronation, Lyra stood in the foyer of the Blackwood family estate. The manor had been seized when Marcus was executed, but Kaine had made its restoration a priority. He'd purchased it back, tracked down pieces of the original furniture, and commissioned artisans to repair a decade of neglect. Now finally it was ready. Lyra walked slowly through the rooms of her childhood, her hand trailing along the restored oak banister. Everything was achingly familiar and slightly strange, like a memory lovingly recreated. She entered her father's study, the room where he had spent countless hours poring over strategic maps and botanical journals, where he had taught her to read, where he had told her stories of the old wolf kings. Kaine had somehow located her father's original desk. It sat beneath the window exactly where it had been when Lyra was 12. On top was a new brass plaque, the Blackwood Strategic Library. Her father's tactical archives, once considered treasonous, had been painstakingly recreated from backup copies. They were now the official reference material for the Council's security forces. Marcus Blackwood's strategies were being studied by a new generation. His name was being spoken with respect and admiration. Lyra sank into the leather chair behind the desk, overwhelmed. She had spent 10 years believing her father's legacy was shame. Now she understood the truth. His legacy was honor, truth, the unshakable belief that doing the right thing mattered even when it cost everything. Kaine found her there an hour later, tears streaming silently down her face as she read through her father's old journals. He knelt beside the chair, taking her hands in his. Talk to me. He wrote about me, Lyra said, her voice breaking. She held up one of the journals. Look, he wrote about teaching me to identify medicinal herbs, about how proud he was that I could name 47 species by scent alone. She looked at Kaine, fresh tears spilling over. He had plans for me. He wanted me to have a future, and Theron took all of it away. Theron took 10 years, Kaine said firmly. He took your childhood and your father and your security. But he didn't take your future, Lyra. You're living it now, and it's better than anything Theron tried to destroy. He helped her to her feet, pulling her into his arms. You honor his memory in everything you do, Kaine murmured into her hair. Not just because you cleared his name, because of who you've become, because you chose courage over bitterness. Lyra buried her face in his chest, letting him hold her as she grieved and healed. 1 year after the coronation, Lyra and Kaine returned to the Cascade Wilderness Reserve at sunset. Lyra was 7 months pregnant, her belly round and prominent beneath her simple traveling dress. She moved more slowly now, careful of her footing, but her eyes were bright with purpose. They carried with them a cutting from Vivian's sanctuary willow, carefully wrapped and ready for planting. The Blackwood family cemetery was small, tucked into a peaceful clearing. Her parents' graves had been unmarked during Lyra's exile, but Kaine had commissioned beautiful headstones of polished granite. Marcus Blackwood, beloved mate, devoted father, guardian of truth. Vivian Blackwood, cherished mate, loving mother, heart of the sanctuary. Lyra knelt carefully beside her father's grave, Kaine supporting her elbow. She planted the willow cutting with her own hands, pressing the soil down tenderly around the young roots. A grove of willows, she said softly, one for each victim of the Ashford conspiracy. So they'll never be forgotten. So something beautiful grows from all that pain. Down already 6 other saplings stood in neat rows, their silver leaves shimmering in the fading light. Each one had been planted in a ceremony with family members of victims present to witness. This one, the 7th, was for her father. Kaine knelt beside her, his large hand covering hers where it rested on her swollen belly. What if it's a girl, he asked. Vivian, Lyra answered immediately. We teach her that honor isn't weakness, that truth is worth fighting for, that her grandfather was a hero. And if it's a boy, Marcus, Lyra said, tears prickling her eyes, for the same reasons. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they sat together beside the grave. The mate bond hummed between them, steady and strong, an ancient thread that had survived assassination attempts, conspiracy, and the weight of a kingdom's expectations. Lyra felt the baby kick. She guided Kaine's hand to the spot, watching his face light up with wonder. She's active tonight, Kaine said softly. Lyra smiled. I know it's a girl, Kaine replied, and she's going to be exactly like her mother, brave and stubborn and absolutely unstoppable. The kingdom doesn't stand a chance, Lyra laughed. As darkness fell, the willow saplings began to glow faintly, their leaves catching the moonlight. It was Marcus Blackwood's genetic masterwork playing out in miniature. 5 years later, a flash of movement darted between the willow trees in the cemetery grove. A little girl with midnight black hair and striking silver-gray eyes laughed as she ran her small hands reaching up to catch silver leaves drifting in the autumn breeze. "Careful, Vivian," Lyra called from the blanket where she sat, one hand resting on her belly, where a second child grew. "Not too far." Kaine caught their daughter mid-run, scooping her up and spinning her in a circle that made her squeal with delight. At 5 years old, Vivian Blackwood Thornwood was exactly as her father had predicted, brave, stubborn, absolutely unstoppable. "Papa, tell me the story again," Vivian demanded, settling into Kaine's lap as he joined Lyra on the blanket. "About Grandpa Marcus in the secret tree." "You've heard it 100 times," Kaine teased, but he was already beginning the tale. As he spoke, weaving the story of Marcus Blackwood's sacrifice and Lyra's courage, Vivian listened with rapt attention. Lyra watched them, her heart so full it ached. The willow grove had grown tall and strong, their silver leaves creating a cathedral of moonlight. The sanctuary gardens beyond the cemetery were thriving, expanded, and modernized, but still honoring Marcus's original work. And in the center of it all, Vivian's sanctuary willow stood as a testament to love that had survived death, betrayal, and time itself. A gentle breeze rustled through the leaves, creating a sound like whispered approval. Lyra smiled, her hand moving to the pendant at her throat. "Thank you, Papa," she whispered to the wind, "for everything." As the sun set over the Cascade Wilderness, the Blackwood Thornwood family sat together beneath the silver willows, surrounded by love and legacy and the unbreakable bonds of pack and family. The outcast who had sat alone at the banquet had become Luna, mother and guardian of a new era. And the truth, as her father had always promised, had set them all free. In the grand ballroom of Shadowpine Manor, thoroughly cleansed of Ashford corruption, the annual solstice banquet was in full swing. But this year there was no table 47 positioned by the kitchen doors. This year, every member of the pack sat as equals. The hierarchical seating arrangements had been abolished by Luna Lyra's first official decree. At the center of the room, Kaine and Lyra presided over the celebration, their daughter Vivian perched on her mother's lap, watching the dancing with wide eyes. Silas Crane stood at attention with the royal guard, his uniform impeccable. He caught Lyra's eye across the room and raised his glass in a silent toast. To truth, to justice, to the Blackwood legacy. Lyra raised her own glass in return, then leaned into Kaine's shoulder, watching her kingdom celebrate in peace and genuine joy. "What are you thinking?" Kaine murmured against her hair. "That I sat alone at a banquet in this room once," Lyra replied softly. "Invisible, ashamed, certain I had no future." She looked up at him, her silver eyes luminous with happiness. "And now I'm surrounded by family, by pack, by love. My father's name is honored. My daughter knows her grandfather was a hero. And the kingdom that once rejected me now calls me Luna." Kaine kissed her forehead gently. "The moon goddess knew what she was doing when she chose you for me." "She did," Lyra agreed, watching Vivian point excitedly at the dancers. "She gave me everything I never knew I needed." As the music swelled and the celebration continued, Lyra closed her eyes and sent one final thought to her father. "We did it, Papa. We brought the truth to light. We built something beautiful from the ashes. And I promise you your legacy will live forever in the hearts of those who remember that honor, truth, and love are worth any sacrifice." The silver leaves of the distant willow grove seemed to shimmer in response, and Lyra knew with absolute certainty that her father was finally at peace.